Hi friends, my name is Angela and welcome to my YouTube channel. Every month I wrap up the books that I read in the month, and that is this video. These are the books that I read in March, and towards the end I'm going to share with you a few books that I am still reading and some books that I am looking forward to getting to in April. March felt slower than I think it actually was, and there's a few reasons for that for me. I didn't read as much as I normally would have read, and that was because I actually picked up a knitting project and that took a lot of my time. I don't think that reading happens in isolation. When you're a reader, it happens alongside everything else in your life and you have to fit it in or fit other things in around it. I know that it's going to be different in April, but I also knew towards the end of March that we had a weekend away. And for that reason, I knew I was going to get in quite a bit of reading in the drive. There was about a 10-hour round trip. And that gave me the space to settle into reading again and finish up some books that I had on the go. But even beyond that, the books that I read this month felt very slow, which was quite apt because I just shared a video about the books that I'm glad I did not rush. But I know that that's part of being a reader. Reading takes place over time. It unfolds naturally in your life. When you try and force it is usually when it's not as enjoyable. But sometimes instead of moving quickly through a book, you find yourself putting it aside and coming back to it time and again. And that's exactly what happened this month. I finished one book that I had been reading on and off for 5 months. The first book I want to talk about is Bitter Honey by Caryl Lewis. It is a quiet and literary novel that leans very much into atmosphere and reflection rather than plot. At its center, it really is about 3 women who converge into this family home. It's a moment where memory and the natural world start to blur in a way, but it is quite grounding. I was very excited to read this book. I read Drift by Caryl Lewis in 2024 and it became one of my top books of that year and one I still recommend wholeheartedly. She's a Welsh author and this is her second novel for adults. I think she's written some children's books in the past that were in Welsh, but this is her second adult novel in English. And I've been reading it for 5 months. I picked it up when I was in New Zealand in October and started reading it then. So this book for me hasn't become so much what it is about, but about how I read it. It just became a book that it wasn't intentional. I wanted to sit down and read this book. It wasn't intentional that I read it piece by piece, but that just felt like the right pace to ingest this story. It was quite a unique feeling where I didn't feel the urgency to finish it like I might with other books where I would be in the story and wanting to find out how this ends. It was just something I kept coming back to. I'd read a couple of chapters maybe, put it down, not come back to it for weeks. And at first that really frustrated me. I was like, this is a small book. It's maybe 300, it's not even 250 pages. And that really frustrated me in the beginning. But then I remembered that, not every book has a set pace and I just need to go with what I feel is right with this one, which was to take it in pieces. And that made it such a unique reading experience. It really shifted something within me. Some books are really better when they unfold over time and others are better when you are immersed 100% in the world. And I think that's what kind of stayed with me out of this. Not because of a particular plot or moment, but was because of how I read it. It really did become a part of my reading life rather than something separate from it. And it's something I want to continue to remember as I go forward, that reading isn't about the progress, but it's about how that book has shown up in your life. In terms of the book itself, it has what I hoped for from Caryl Lewis. It has some beautiful prose, moments that were so real and yet so poetic that I really loved, and I've copied a number of things out into my commonplace book from it. It was a book that was quiet on so many levels, from the way that I read it to the story itself, and I wholeheartedly recommend it. Also in March, I read The Labyrinth by Amanda Lohrey, and this was our read-along for March, and we ultimately had 35 people join us for the read-along on Storygraph. It was a fantastic experience. The reading of the book while being able to talk about it with people, I think, was ideal. This is a really good book club pick. So thank you everyone that joined us in that read-along this month. So The Labyrinth is an award-winning novel and it follows a woman named Erica who moves to a quiet beachside town to be closer to her son who has been incarcerated for a horrific crime. The book is really anchored in this idea that the cure for many ills is to build something, to work with your hands, and that's what Erica turns to in her grief and her guilt. While living in this shack on the coast, she becomes increasingly obsessed about building a labyrinth, which is both a physical structure but also a kind of pathway through to her past. And through that process, she begins to connect with the people around her. This is quite a difficult book to explain because I think it is more of a feeling as opposed to a plot. In fact, a lot of us in the read-along did confess that we didn't expect to have as much plot in here as there was. It feels very slow and reflective as Erica does a lot of time looking back on her past, but at the same time, it was a very fast read for a book that felt like a slow read. It's a very short one, but I was surprised when I was on the last couple of pages. It's a very quick read as opposed to being fast-paced, I think is what I'm trying to say. It had this strange quality of a book that you could move through quickly while still feeling that you were sitting in something. And I think that comes in part from the way it was written. I believe Amanda Lohrey is also an essayist as well as a novelist. And that's kind of how this book felt. It felt like it was, to me at times, it felt like a series of essays that were stitched together by this common thread. More interested about exploring ideas as opposed to more moving forward with a plot. The writing itself is very easy to fall into. It had a fantastic opening line that everyone loved. Let me begin in my father's house. I grew up in an asylum, a manicured madhouse. That was a great opening line, but someone in the read-along described it as feeling like you were sitting around a campfire listening to someone tell you a story, and I think it really did have that storytelling feeling. Quiet and immersive while still having a very strong sense of place. And a lot of us connected with that. It was very easy to be drawn into. But where the discussion really opened up was the ending. A lot of people felt that the ending fell a little flat, that there was resolution that hadn't yet happened that was needed. And I did feel that too, to an extent. So there's this interesting tension of how the experience of reading the book was very absorbing, but the ending left me wanting. Although, like I said, a lot of us expected that to be the way it was going to end. It felt more like a book that was about the process as opposed to the ending. And definitely one that you could spend a lot of time thinking about long after you finished it. If you did enjoy this book, Amanda Lohrey has a couple of other novels that are out, but she has a new one coming out this year called Capture, and I think there are a few people who are interested in looking for that one as well. After reading Devotion in February, I mentioned that I had only one Hannah Kent book left to read, and lo and behold, I read it in March. This is Hannah Kent's sophomore novel. It is her novel after Burial Rites, and being her last book that I have now read, it is very bittersweet. It's set in Ireland in 1825 in a rural location, and it is deeply rooted in folklore and superstition, and as usual, Hannah Kent has just researched this incredibly well, because that atmosphere, for me, really defined the reading experience. So the story begins with a woman named Nora who has lost her daughter and her husband in the same year. She's now caring for her 4-year-old grandson who cannot speak, who cannot walk. And as the community starts to whisper that they feel there is something wrong in her household, that perhaps he is a changeling, those beliefs start to shape the decisions that are made. There are 2 other perspectives we follow, 2 other women. The first is Mary, who is a teenage girl brought into Nora's home to help her care for her grandson, and an older woman named Nance, who is known for her knowledge of the good people, which are the fairy folk, that are believed to exist alongside the human world. As I said, Hannah Kent's books are always incredibly well researched, and this one was really well done in the sense that it really showed you how extensive the belief systems were and how those beliefs shaped everyday life. The way people understood misfortune and illness and even responsibility were all filtered through these beliefs. And it is definitely one of those books where you feel the weight of it as a reader. There are so many small and specific rituals throughout the book, things that people do to protect themselves, to ward off evil, and all those details really made the world feel incredibly real. But it also made it very overwhelming because as a reader, you of course have a very different perspective to the characters in the book. And this creates such a tension because you're powerless to intervene and you just have to watch it unfold. I honestly had no idea how this book was going to end. And afterwards, there is an afterword by Hannah Kent where she talks about the real case that this story is based on, which adds this extra layer of weight. And I think that's really where this book interrupted my momentum. It is a wonderfully written book, but it is not a comfortable book to read at all. There are moments in this book where I wanted to look away. It was just so raw and real. Hannah Kent's writing is beautiful, lyrical, rich. She is well cemented in one of my top authors of all time. But this one did feel slightly different to her other novels. Perhaps it was a little heavier in the detail, which I feel at times came at the expense of the plot and character development. I do think it is such a powerful example of how belief structures influence our behaviour, and how those beliefs can sometimes have some very real damaging consequences. Now, this next book is going to be very left of centre. It's not a book I would have read on my own, but I also read The Soulmate by Sally Hepworth. It's a domestic suspense novel, and it's a new-ish released, and I read it because I had joined a book club in my neighbourhood, and this was the book they read last month. To be honest, I wanted to try reading a little more socially rather than widen the books that I was reading. So while this isn't a book I would have picked up by myself, the conversation that came with it with the people that I was in the book club with was so rewarding. So I'm so grateful that I picked it up and joined that experience. So this book follows a couple who are living on this cliffside location, and it's a location that is known as a suicide hotspot. People go there deliberately just to end their lives. And the husband has a history of intervening those people. He's had a good success rate where he has prevented people from jumping, except one day when he doesn't. As I mentioned, this is not a book I would have picked up on my own, and I feel a little validated in that. There are a few plot points that don't hold up, and I found it very difficult to believe and empathise with the characters. But it did keep me engaged. I wanted to find out the ending. And looking at the other books that I've read, I think it served as a real lighter palate cleanser for me, so it was quite welcome in that sense. And I'm glad to have read a Sally Hepworth novel, although I don't know if I'll pick up another one. I do understand she has others that are much more beloved than this, but I don't know. I don't know if it's really for me. It was just wonderful to be in a room with women in my neighbourhood that love to read and talk about books, and that was the win for me having read this book. I'm looking forward to see what they pick next month. Perhaps even more left of centre was I read Candide or Optimism by Voltaire in March. This is philosophical satire, and it is the first full text that I read, which is as a companion book alongside my Paradise Lost project, Freedom After the Fall. So it follows Candide as he and his friends experience increasingly absurd and extremely violent misfortunes, all the while holding on to the belief that everything happens for the best. This was a really interesting experience to read. I do consider myself to be an optimistic person, and this book was kind of answering or addressing the question around at what point does optimism become denial? A way of explaining things away instead of seeing them fully for what they are in reality. And I found that quite interesting. It is not an easy book to read. It flows well, but my gosh, the things they went through, I was like, Candide, come on. It is a very short book. It's like half of this book is commentary and appendices and stuff, but it was I'm glad to have read my first full text for the Paradise Lost project. That was great to have done that. It gave me a lot to think about. And then another book that I listened to, it was my book of choice while driving around, is When the Going Was Good by Graydon Carter. And Graydon Carter was the editor at Vanity Fair for a number of years until fairly recently. So it's a memoir centred around his publishing career and his time at Vanity Fair, as well as a few other key publications, and its proximity to the entertainment industry and by extent Hollywood. It moves through his time at various publishing houses, including his time at Vanity Fair, all the while bringing up some cultural moments that really shaped and defined that period of history. This feels like one of those books that, for me, it was feeding that mental file that I have, and I believe everyone has their own file, of useless but interesting information. And for me, that is around pop culture and the entertainment industry over probably the 20th century in particular. I am the person that you want on your team for a trivia night when those questions pop up. But that said, I'm less interested in those moments themselves in history and about the work behind the moment, which there were a lot of great stories around that in this book, so I found it quite engaging. It captures a period in magazine publishing which is now considered to be a golden age of publishing. It does feel like it is fading now. A lot of magazines are no longer being published and certainly not being published in the way they were. So it really added a reflective layer to it. I enjoyed it, and the audiobook was narrated by Graydon, so that was interesting too. So those were the books that I read. Let me share with you books that I currently have on the go. I did not read a word of Cloud Cuckoo Land in March. I apologise to my friend Michelle. I didn't read any of it. I think maybe she didn't read any of it either. Now, having confessed that I am an optimistic person, I think that something I take away from that is that we have to understand that there are books that will take our focus and we need to be in and we want to be in, and others that we can put down and come back to when we're ready for them. So that is my silver lining in this situation. I've also started reading The Sun Walks Down by Fiona McFarlane. I'm about a third of the way through. It is got a lot of characters. It is slowly building up. I'm quite enjoying it. It is very much grounded in place and perspective in this outback area in South Australia. And it's one of those books where when I pick it up, I feel a shift within me as I come into this world. It's really interesting. It does feel like another slower, intentional read, but I'm enjoying this one. This is currently my first book that I'm wanting to pick up at the moment. And there are also a couple of new releases that I want to pick up this month. They are very different, but both very much within that literary fiction feeling that I have been leaning into recently. First is Some Bright Nowhere by Anne Packer. It's a character-driven contemporary novel, and it's about what it really means to love someone and the reckoning that comes with that as you're approaching the final chapter of someone's life. The other new release I have is very different, and that is Jesus Christ Kinski from Benjamin Myers. This is going to be a complete fever dream of a book, I think. It's a book about a film about a live performance of Jesus. It is going to be a wild ride. You never really know what you're going to get with Benjamin Myers, but the thing I have learned is that at the end of the day, I always enjoy it. I enjoy the ride that he takes us on. So this will be fun. So I had a really good month of reading at the end of the day when, like I said, it was not my priority for the month of March. But again, I think that is part of having a reading life, as it fits in where you are at that moment. It's not necessary to rush books, and some books are better to be lived in over a longer period of time. It's just a few lessons that I've gotten out of this month. And I love it when my reading life feels deliberate, when I look back on the month that was and I can see those decisions that I made, and I feel really comfortable with that. Thank you so much for joining me as I look back on my March in reading. I would love to know what your favourite book of March was. If I had to pick a favourite, I think Better Honey was a real experience and I loved the book. I think that The Good People was probably the book that really stopped me in my tracks as I read it this month. And yeah, maybe I'll just have to reread Burial Rites now because I don't have any other Hannah Kents to read. But thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful week of reading ahead, and I'll speak with you soon. Bye.